testing Redefined, the browser pooling method. Hey guys, my name is Puja Jagani. I think Arun already helped cover the base as to who I am. But yeah, I work at Browstack, pretty much at the intersection of open source and developer advocacy. So pretty much, let's get started. Again, I think my hello slide has been covered, but just some contact information in case you have any questions that we're not able to get to as a part of the session, or you have some follow-up questions regarding this session that I can help you with. So I think now that you know a little bit about me from Arun, he's given a good highlight as to what I do. Let's quickly jump into the agenda so we can make sure that we're able to cover what we have planned for today. I'll get started with talking about private browsing modes, what they are, kind of explain what they are, and how it makes sense to kind of then use it in automation, right? Or test automation. And then we talk about challenges in testing in parallel today when you're testing with browsers. Then we kind of move on to then understand the new WebDriver BiDi protocol and the technical terms like user context, which is what makes it possible to use a single browser to run multiple tests in parallel. And then we see it all in action. So we see a demo as to how do you do it, how do you code for it, how does our old approach look, and what's the new approach, the browser pooling, where you can use a single browser. And we kind of wrap up with the benefits of browser pooling. I'm going to try my best to make sure we have sufficient time for questions and answers in the end, but if not, feel free to reach out to me and I'll be happy to answer all your questions. So what is the private browsing mode, right? So this is a definition I took from Wikipedia, but in this mode, the browser initiates a temporary session separate from its main session and user data, right? And I think this sums up the definition very well. So what it's trying to say is it starts a totally new session, which is temporary in nature, right? So if you enter a private browsing mode, it's a different session from your main session that you're browsing. And this session is totally isolated from your main session. That means it does not share any data from the main session. So when you enter a private browsing mode, it has its own session history, session cookie, session things like that. It does not take anything from your main session, which you typically browse it. So there's no data sharing. It's totally designed for session privacy. And I think most of us have used this. I think if you do a quick Google search of a private browsing mode, you see something like this. Basically, every browser has a private browsing mode. So, for example, Google has the famous incognito mode. I think a lot of us have used that. Mozilla has something called as a private browsing. Wikipedia also has defined the same definition that it has. But if you think um, Safari, like Apple, so for Safari on your phones or on your tablets, they also have a private browsing mode, and that's what they call it. Edge has a private browsing mode that's called in private. It's not listed here, but if you scroll and stuff like that, you should be able to see it. So my point being, be it mobile browser or be it your desktop browser, all of them support private browsing mode. Some might call it a different name, but they serve the same purpose, right? They serve the purpose of having a temporary isolated browsing session. That means you get a clean slate, right? So think of it as writing on a whiteboard. So you enter a room, you're writing something on a whiteboard, and when you leave the room, you totally erase it. So there's no trace of what activities have been done in that duration on the whiteboard. So in a private browsing session, you can browse through, look through things, and do whatever you like. And then when you close it, poof, it's gone. Yes, your internet provider will know the websites you visited, but otherwise, there's no cache, saved passwords, no data, cookies, and things like that that has, kept a trace of. So it's no longer there. It doesn't interfere with your existing browsing that you do, or like, for example, how typically you create a Google Chrome profile, or in Mozilla, if you're browsing, you'll have your own main thing that you use. It doesn't interfere with that. And I think now that I've spoken sufficiently about what private browsing mode is, let's quickly glance over as to what kind of data it does not save, right? And why it makes sense in testing space. So when you're doing test automation, when you're doing browser automation testing, why does this totally make sense, right? At this point, so let's get started with the first item. It's the browsing history. So anytime you visited a page, if you're like, if you do like a Google search, you see like a link turn purple because you visited it. But when you also sometimes revisit a page, right, and your browser has kept track that you're visiting this page again, there's a difference in behavior for that page sometimes, right? Because they've been trying to track you, they're trying to optimize your user experience. So um, that's not ideal for testing, right? So for testing, you want a blank, clean slate. You like, you want each interaction to be as if you're starting from scratch. You don't want any historical data to impact your current experience, or especially your testing purpose. And similar to this comes the form fills, right? So anytime you have a form, you might see a browser auto-filling some data, or it will have some historical data saved based on your past, what you filled. But now imagine that in testing. So suppose your first test case has tested an error situation, so you filled in all the wrong data. Now you go to the same browser, but without any data being cleared in the same instance. And now you're willing to test a success or a happy path. So you really can't use the data that was wrong when you tested the error path before, right? So you kind of again want to mainly see how the user interacts with the form when they enter the fresh data and test that, because each test case serves a purpose, right? So you again in a private browsing mode, it's fresh. There's no data, so you get a clean slate, and that's why it makes sense to have something like this for your test automation. Next is search history. So when you're again, so I think there are a lot of websites that based on your search history, they will give you different experience. They will try to personalize your experience or give you recommendations and things like that. So when you're testing, you really again don't want the past scrolling or the past behavior to impact your current test, because two tests are totally different. So again, you don't want this data stored. Um, Next is bookmarks. So private browsing mode doesn't store bookmarks. I don't think it's that point is very relevant in the testing space. So we can move on. The next one is my favorite, cookies. So how many times has it happened that you've written tests and where one test is meant to log you in and the other test is meant to log you out, and you try to run them together, and all sorts of clashes have happened. So unexpected behavior comes in because of cookies, right? Because cookies track a lot of your login, logout data. You also have third party cookies that are kind of tracking your behavior online. But again, when you're writing a test, for each test case, you want a fresh, clean slate. Because if you're doing a test case that's testing logout, you actually just want to do that. You don't want something that's done by some other test interfering with that. So private browsing mode doesn't have any cookie data stored, which is again great for testing. And the last one is passwords. I think one of the most common scenarios in automation testing is testing how um, the login, where you ask the user to put their username and password, and you actually want to see how it looks when they actually do it versus an autofill from the browser. So pretty much you actually want a good clean slate so your tests do the expected thing instead of the environment interfering with it. Um, yeah, so now let's move on to, I think, now that we've covered why having something like a private browsing mode or a fresh, clean slate makes a lot of sense for test automation, let's also see how is this correlated to parallel testing, right? So, what are the main challenges in testing in parallel? So, testing in parallel sounds fun, I think. So it's like, oh, let's test everything, let's speed up our tests, fail fast, get a faster feedback, save all the time. And who doesn't want to save time, right? But it's hard. I think testing in parallel is like maintaining a highway where you have multiple lanes, but each lane needs like, so each like vehicle needs a dedicated lane, right? You really can't merge it all up, or you really can't mess it all up, because then there'll be like horrible traffic jams or worse, accidents. So I think one of the major challenges in parallel testing is test isolation. So it obviously depends on how well the tests are written, what does the setup look like, what does the cleanup look like. But writing your test in isolation, you again don't want your tests to interfere with each other when they're running in parallel. So that means a lot of thought has to be put in how you're designing your tests. Second is, I think, dynamic data collision. So you might have a database where when you're on a test database, when you're running your test, everything is kind of updated or read from a particular database. So when multiple tests are running in parallel, you kind of need to be sure of the data that you're writing or you're removing or you're deleting, and then what you're finally asserting on. Because there could be collision, there could be um, unexpected behaviors that kind of trickle in. And I think third is, and I think this is a very important one, is resource consumption. So where you're testing in parallel with browsers, um, what happens is you're running multiple browsers at the same time in a machine, and that is very CPU intensive. That is very memory heavy. Browsers are memory heavy in nature, right? Or you can start up a browser, open multiple tabs, and go look at your memory usage. And you will get an idea. So it does take up a lot of resources. That means it also takes up a little bit more time than you would typically expect. So parallel testing is faster, but then it will also have this some time taken to kind of start up the browsers, allocate these resources, optimize those resources, and then, shut a browser down. So it kind of, those are the added times as well. So I think these are the different challenges that exist uh, in testing in parallel today for browsers, which is how it's being done. So what's the next solution? Enter WebDriver BiDi. So, like I said, I think Arun mentioned in my introduction, I'm one of the core committers for Selenium, and anyone who's used Selenium might have heard of the WebDriver protocol. But if you've not, and that's okay. So WebDriver, or now it's called as WebDriver Classic Protocol, is an HTTP protocol which talks to something called a WebDriver, which is nothing but a remote control for the browser. It knows how to talk to a browser. It's an executable. So for like Chrome, you would have a Chrome driver. For Firefox, you would have a Gecko driver. Each browser has its own driver. And your framework like Selenium or anything that's based out of WebDriver protocol will then talk to this WebDriver executable, which then will go talk to the browser. So for WebDriver Classic, it was using an HTTP protocol to do it. So the new age protocol is called the WebDriver BiDi protocol. This is actually an amalgamation of developer tools, or little with a thought of automation. So it's developed how your Chrome DevTools or DevTools operate to provide that rich functionality, and it uses WebSocket, so there is more bi-directional communication, hence the name BiDi. But it's designed with keeping automation in mind, right? So if you issue a command using WebDriver BiDi, it will open a WebSocket connection, send things to the WebDriver, which will then have a WebSocket to talk to the browser. But why am I talking about this protocol? The reason I'm talking about this protocol is this protocol offers something very, very cool, which kind of lets us use a single browser to run multiple tests in parallel instead of using multiple different browsers and consuming all the resources. So just quick highlight on WebDriver BiDi protocol. But if you're interested about exactly what this is and what features it provides more, I have done talks on this in the past. You can Google and you'll find something on YouTube. There are also good articles by folks from Chrome, Mozilla, and things like that on the internet if you're interested as well. You can always reach out to me and I can help you out as well. So this is how currently we test, right? So on the left, we have a browser instance. Each single instance of a browser has its own storage. If you see, like I've marked the orange pane, it has its own storage. So all the tabs that you open for that browser instance, or all the windows in that browser instance, all of them share the same storage, right? So when you're doing your normal browsing, when you open a separate window in the same profile or a separate tab, you see your session data, you see your cookies, you get your autofill password suggestions, like all your behavior is tracked. It's all there. You can see that flow, right? So for testing, you're like, okay, I don't think this is useful for me when I want to run multiple tests. So you start another instance of a browser, a new instance of a browser, then has its own separate storage. So these become two separate things. So one browser has its own storage, second has its own storage. And whatever you open in either of them, they share that storage. So if you open browser one, if you open a single tab, and it'll have its storage, but say another browser, you open multiple tabs, they share a storage. But these are separate browser instances to do that. And that's how we do our testing today, because literally there is no better way to do that. Yes, you can design your tests to use a single browser even in the modern day, but then there are a lot of interferences and a lot of steps a lot of just nature of how browser works that might not work in your favor for very common scenarios. So now I spoke about WebDriver BiDi, and it offers something called as a user context. Now think of a user context as just a technical term. So just don't fixate a lot on it. But a user context is nothing but it lets you create a fresh session. When I say a fresh session, it's nothing but a session which will have its browser session, which will have its own storage, right? So you can use a single browser and in that browser create a user context. That user context will have its own storage and that will have all your history, cookies, and things like that. And then you can choose which browsing context. Browsing context is nothing but like a tab or a window or anything you can navigate to can be associated with that user context. So you get the full flexibility in your tests to go like, hey, open a single browser. I want to start a fresh user context. I want this to behave like a fresh, clean slate of a session and put the first tab in there. And I'm going to run my test there. Now, I want to run another test in parallel. So I'm saying create another user context, let it have its own storage because that's what BiDi can do for you. And take another two tabs and I want them to share this particular user context. And the reason I'm doing this is probably you're trying to test that when you click on something, it opens a new tab and how it behaves, and you want the data sharing. Probably that's why. So user context is very, very powerful. As you can see from the previous image in this, the major difference is using a single browser. And that's why I like to call it browser pooling, where it's like, yeah, you're using a single instance of the browser to run multiple tests, like how you would typically carpool. So let's quickly have a look at the video as to how we write tests today. I have taken a simple website that tests behavior based on its cookie, like it sets a cookie for a background color, right? So if I click on different buttons, it kind of changes the background and sets a cookie. And so that you can just see the behavior. So I click on light blue, it does light blue, and it sets a cookie. So we're just going to then go see that the cookie is already set. Yeah, so it's set the theme as light blue, and it's going to kind of use that as long as we are in a session that's sharing the data, it will kind of use it. So it's light green now, and on reset, it'll just like become white. So I'm just setting a cookie in my tests. So anything that I set in this background and open a new tab in the same browser instance will reflect the behavior of the cookie, right? So if it's blue is blue, I do light green and I open like another tab. You can see this because it's cookie, it's being tracked. It's using the data from the cookie for the background. But if I open a private window, like an incognito tab, no behaviors, right? It does not store the cookie. It has nothing. It's a private, separate instance where it has absolutely no idea, no cookies stored. It's a clean slate. This is just to show that, private browsing does not store cookies, and that's why your life, if you're testing such an application, would be easier. Okay. I think now that we've seen this part, yeah, like that's pretty much what I'm trying to show here. Yeah, and I think we can quickly go over these are the tests that I have written as to how you would do parallel. So you define a WebDriver variable. This is specific to Selenium, and then you set options for your browser. You can do WebSocket URL true. This capability means you're telling the browser, I want to use WebDriver BiDi, so that they can make the socket connection. And then I just create a Firefox driver. And I've written a few tests. For example, can switch to blue. So I've written a test to check that my initial background color is white. And when I click on the blue button, it changes the background color to blue. It's just a simple test. You can always go over it. And I'm doing some assertions to see how the color has changed. Right? So this is static background color is, well, first we check it's white, and then you click on the button, and then you kind of see that, uh, yeah, they kind of see that you're able to then check if it's blue. Background color is blue. And I think we do a similar thing to switch to green. It's exactly same test, but now you check that you click on the green button and the background color is green. I mean, it's literally that. I also print out the thread we are running in so that then you know parallelly when you're running tests sequentially or in parallel, because then they'll run in separate threads if you're running it in parallel. So that's that. And yeah, I just check to if there's a default background color, it's white or that's it. So if you see all three have three separate states, which will kind of be governed by three cookie, like, cookie behavior. So what we do is we try to actually create a separate browser for each. So like you see, we do before each. So you're creating a separate driver, which means a separate browser. And we're running the tests. Um, and they pass, but like you see, we're opening three separate browser instances. And we're doing this sequentially. And yeah, I mean, the tests pass. They're all running on the same thread, and I think that's fine. And I run, sorry, I think that went on fast. And then I try to run the same tests in parallel. Yep, I try to run the same tests in parallel. Again, three instances. And I mean, they're okay, but they're running successfully in parallel because they're using three separate instances. So there is no interference from their end, right? So, yeah. But now imagine you're trying to write the same tests, but you're using just one instance. So it's the same test, and now I've switched it to use a single instance of WebDriver. So that means we now want to use the same tests to use one single browser instance. Like, and we've not changed much, but we just changed the test setup to not create a separate browser each time. It's the same set of tests, nothing different. And they will fail, and for an obvious reason, because now you're in one browser, and every time you're trying to run tests, they're interfering with each other based on the cookie behavior, right? Yeah, see, assertions failed because when you're trying to switch to green, it worked, but now that has switched to green. So when you're testing another test and validating the background is white, it's no longer white because they're all sharing cookies. It's interfering with each other. And here we tried the old school way of kind of running it with a single browser, and it failed. It did not work, right? Now, how about we do this with BiDi? So with BiDi, it should work because now we have the concept of user context where you can kind of use a single browser. Again, we're using one driver. It's a static variable. And in that, we kind of set up and define that, hey, for each test, create a separate tab, right? So these steps are the same that we went through earlier. There's not much difference in the setup that we have. I think what's noteworthy is the setup that we have next. So before each test, we are doing this one minor setup where we are creating a user context, a fresh slate, and we are assigning a new tab to it. So we're saying that please run each of my tests in a separate tab in an isolated manner. This is literally what the code is doing. You can always dig into it later. I have a link at the end. And we're just telling, hey, please use this tab and this user context and make it fresh. So have like multiple tabs for each test and run it, literally. And I think we then have the tests, the same tests, but now they are written using the WebDriver BiDi protocol. And I've written everything using WebDriver BiDi just to show that you could do the same things. It's just a separate API. So we're checking the background is white, clicking on the blue button, and then pretty much asserting that, the background style, like the color style, is blue, like the background color is blue. So it's literally doing the same thing, just using a separate API. That's why it looks a little different. And again, just printing the threads. Same way we're trying to do it to switch it to green. And we're literally doing the same thing that we did before, but now just asserting for a light green color. That's all that we're doing. And again, checking the default color to be white. It's the same API, it's repetitive. That's why I'm kind of going through. And now the interesting part is we're using just one instance. But now let's see how we run it. It could be sequential or in parallel. So this one is sequential. You see 3 tabs opened up. It ran a test and we used a single browser instance, all ran on the same thread. That worked out okay. And you can see that it saves a lot of time. And now let's try to do the same thing, and run the test in parallel. You will see that it ran on separate tests. So you see 3 tabs in parallel. The tests have run and tests have passed just using one browser instance. And like you see, they've run on 3 separate threads. That means it's a proof that they ran in parallel. So yeah, that's how you do browser pooling. That was a demo to show that. And if you're wondering if I want to go do this in Selenium today, this is the status of all these APIs. So if you see Java, JavaScript, and .NET have it implemented, most of it. For Ruby, things are in progress. So there are pull requests open. Could have potentially been closed by now. I've not checked for today. And for Python, we need to get started on a lot of things. So we're looking for maintainers in case anyone's interested in coming to Selenium and contributing these APIs. We already have examples how to do it in Java, JavaScript, so that can always act as an inspiration. So yes, you can go do this today. And just like a quick closing part as to what are the benefits, right? Like I said, browsers are memory heavy. So when you go from running 5 tests in 5 browsers to running 5 tests in one browser, it saves a lot of memory. That means it also saves a lot of CPU because again, you're not running 5 separate browser instances. You are now running a single browser instance. So it saves a lot of processing power. So your machine at tests can do a lot of other things while the tests are running. Right. So you're not blocked because your tests are running. You're not like, oh my God, I need my hands at the keyboard because I have 10 instances of the browser on my machine and my machine is dying. Third is the execution time because browser startup is a long process. It takes some time to start up a browser and clean up afterwards. Starting multiple browsers and closing them does take a significant amount of time. So that is cut significantly if you've gone from 4 instances to 1 instance or 100 instances to 10 instances. Right? And infrastructure, it could be you don't need as much powerful infrastructure anymore, or you don't need to be then renting out machines on the cloud, which are so many, because you can get the job done in way lesser machine requirements. And this also is better for like carbon footprint in general. So if you're renting infrastructure on the cloud or you have your own device labs, you can utilize them far better. Uh, just you can leave a snapshot. If you want to take a screenshot of the things, these are just some resources that have helped me design this. I've helped implement the BiDi protocol in Selenium, mainly in Java and JavaScript. So that's how I understood you can do this amazing feature here. But I've also ensured that the code that I used in the demo is a part of the Selenium examples repo, which is the last link. I'll just wait here for like 2 seconds to let anyone capture it if they're interested to go try this out. Yeah, and happy testing. Thank you so much for joining and listening to me. I'll be happy to take questions if any, and if the time permits.
Just a second. I'm not sure why my cam
No
not able to.
problem.
Yeah.
No worries.
But yeah, what I'll do is, folks, we have a hard stop at 8:05, but we can surely pick one question. I'll just check which question I've got the most questions. Upvotes. The
Hmm.
question is, what tool are you folks able to see the question on the screen? I'll just read it out, not a problem. Just a second. What tools and strategies can be used to perform manual, automated, or AI-based testing in the private browser mode, especially for security reasons?
Yeah, so I think Okay, about tools or strategies के about manual, automated, and testing in private. So private browsing mode, that's a totally separate question. Like I understand where that's coming from, but this was kind of to show as to how you can run automated tests in parallel using the underlying technology of private browsing mode. So I think that is a little out of scope for this. So can we take another question because we have a minute?
Oh, sure. The next question, any tips to manage login or session state across pooled browser instance?
Across an old browser instance.
Yes.
Okay, so you can run any browser instance that you like. So what tips to manage login or session state? Pooled browser, sorry. Any
Yeah.
tips to manage login session across pooled browser state? Okay, so if you're looking to then, if you want to keep the session information consistent, you can pick a user context and assign which tabs you want to it. Or you can assign the entire browser to have a single context. That means all of them will share the data if that's how your tests are designed. But if you're looking to kind of isolate them in groups, say my two tabs should be sharing certain data and my one tab should be totally running in isolation, you can do that using browser pooling method as well. You can create two separate user contexts and just give flexibility that this tab goes here, this tab goes here, and you have total.
Yeah. Pooja, I think we lost you in between.
Sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, okay, we are a bit over a minute, but I was saying that um, WebDriver BiDi gives you full flexibility. So you can either decide that for an entire browser instance, I want just one, I want the data to be shared, and you can just give it a single user context, or you can divide your browser into as many tabs as it can support and then group them how you like and give them separate user context. So you can decide that I want my session data to be shared by this bunch of tabs or windows and assign it a particular user context, and you want another tab to be running total isolation, you can give it a separate user context. So pretty
Perfect.
much how I did it in the test, you can do it the same way.
Yes. Thanks a lot, folks. Thanks a lot, Pooja, for taking our time. Folks, please make sure you folks are following and connecting with Pooja. And I'll request everyone to let's jump on to the next session. Just a second. Yeah. Well, I'll see you in the next session, folks. Thanks a lot once again, Pooja, for taking our time. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thanks,
Yeah.
folks, for joining.
Yeah.